Good morning. How's everybody doing? Welcome to All Things Open. I'm excited to be one of the first speakers on this first day here. And that was perfect timing, laptop. Hold on. There we go. OK, we're back in business. That's a great start. It can only be uphill from there, right? So my name is Aaron Ladage. I am a UI engineer for a company called DEG. We're based out of Kansas City. And I'm here today to talk to you guys a little bit about responsive frameworks, and specifically Bootstrap. This is a fairly high-level, sort of intro-level talk on this, but I wanted to kind of get a little bit of a feel from you guys on what everybody does in terms of their teams. So I have the benefit of actually working for an agency where we're able to sort of hyper-specialize, and we have a very dedicated UI team. How many people are in a situation like that, where you're working specifically on front-end development? OK, a decent number. Good, good. And I hope I can provide some information and details for you guys, maybe some ammunition, if nothing else, if you're going back with some opinions on Bootstrap. We'll get into what those opinions might be in just a little bit. But how many of you are more front-end, or even have to do just a little bit of everything, a little bit of full stack on development? OK, well, actually, I hope this talk is for you guys also. So I've tried to tailor this in a way that will hopefully have some points for everyone involved here. So like I said, I work for a company called DEG. I would not be here today without their support. So just to give a quick shout out to them, my slides are going to look awesome today, and I'm sorry. Everything is going great. I can talk and fix resolution at the same time, I promise. So to give you guys an idea about DEG, we've gotten some notoriety in the recent days as a company that is one of the 25 companies changing the world. I can talk, I swear. That is not going to work well. OK. This might be my only slide that's a problem like that. We'll see. All right, so I'm not changing the world with my slides, but we were recognized in Inc. magazine as a company that was changing the world, and that was largely based on our entrepreneurial model. And that's the idea that if you're part of DEG, you kind of pursue your passions, and they will support that. For me, that for a long time has been speaking. So that's part of the reason that I'm here. We're a full stack agency. You can see bits of half of words of what we do, which is a little bit of everything: web development, email marketing, you name it, we do it. Sort of half cut off there. I am from Kansas City, so I have to give my required shout out for our amazing barbecue, although North Carolina, you guys got it going on too. And I have at least 4 more games to talk about our World Series, or World Champion Royals. So looking like the Indians at the moment, but we'll see. So like I said, we're here to talk a little bit about responsive frameworks today. And I think before we can really talk about them, it's important to know the history of frameworks and kind of where they came from. So shocker here for anyone under a certain age, there was a time where we couldn't actually look at the internet while we were going to the bathroom. So to paraphrase a very smart developer named Jeremy Keith, the web's actually always been responsive right up until developers came along and broke it. And so the web really was broken for a long, long time. I've been a full-time developer for about 12 years and front end for about 5 or 6 of that. And the web was really broken for a long time. How many of you have written this style? And I apologize, I know the screen is small and distorted. But how many of you have ever written CSS that says something like container with a width of 960 pixels? All right, you all just dated yourself if you raised your hand, because 960 follows a very specific time period. But that fixed width container, that was the foundation of the web for a pretty long time. And then a funny thing happened around about 2007. Anybody want to guess what that was? Smartphone. It was actually the advent of the iPhone. And I do have a MacBook up here, but I'm not coming at this from a Apple fanboy perspective. And then again in 2010 with the tablet. The reason I bring up the iPhone is because of the browser that it contained. It was one of the first devices to bring the full web experience to a mobile device. And I want to play a little clip from 2007 of Steve Jobs actually introing the original iPhone. And this is, I'm sure, going to go really well, because it's always good to mix in AV with your presentation.
I'll show you Safari running on a mobile device. So let's go to the web. And here we are. I'm going to load in, rather than apple.com here, a little more universal site. I'm going to load in the New York Times. It's kind of a slow site because it's got a lot of images, but here we are loading it. We're loading it over Wi-Fi right now. And rather than just give you a WAP version of the New York Times, rather than give you this wrapped version all around, we're showing you the whole New York Times website, and there it is. And guess what I can do? I can just put this into landscape mode, and there it is right there. And I can scroll here if I want. Scroll up and down here. Boom. It's still loading it in. There we go. Or I can just get back like this. Now, this is really great, and I can see the whole page, but of course I can't read it. It's a little too small. So I can get in with my fingers and pinch it, but we have an optimization here. I can just double tap on anything, and it automatically fills up the screen with it. And I can just scroll around like this and scroll over here, and I can even make this text bigger if I want to. And there it is. And just double tap again to get back to the full page. Isn't this cool? And so I'm just, look at this. There is the New York Times. And again, any article I want, boom. There we go.
Sorry about the awkward technicals there. So there's some funny things about that video, I think. It's kind of telling. That was only 2007, but first of all, did anybody notice the broken flash icon on the New York Times homepage? He was demoing the New York Times homepage, and the flash icon, the flash plugin didn't load, obviously. That was probably a sign of things to come. But it's interesting to think that that's 2007. Okay, it's 2016. That is 9 years. But it's amazing to see how far we've come with mobile web development in that short amount of time. And what I think is really interesting was in 2007, displaying that full desktop website on a mobile device was revolutionary. We'd moved on from other lesser implementations of the web on mobile, and this was a pretty big revelation. You heard people oohing and ahhing and cheering. It also didn't load very fast, which is more related to some other things. But and I also think it's interesting that pinch and zoom and double tap were actually introduced as features. And they are really cool when you think about them. If you're on a website where you need to zoom in on an image or zoom in on a piece of text or something like that, it's cool that it's optimized to be able to find that block of content and do that. However, I think a lot of us these days get a little annoyed by that. There's a little dissonance there when you're on a page and it's like, oh, great, it's not optimized, and you have to start doing the pinching and zooming. So it's interesting to see that what was the feature back then is now sort of the annoyance today. So we got to this place where we have these smartphones that have this full web browser on them, and developers had to start coming up with ways to deal with this. So originally, they really did nothing. They did one of two things. They either did nothing, and they just went with Steve Jobs' recommendation, which was the desktop site that you can pinch and zoom, or they built a separate mobile site, the dreaded m.whatever.com. And those are obviously still around today, and they do have their use cases for sure. But in general, I think nowadays these are seen as a little less good. But then something else happened in 2010, and that is an article came out. And it's not to say that this man invented responsive web design, but he did coin the term, and he did put sort of a fine point on a lot of different concepts that people had been starting to think about for quite a while. And that was the idea of responsive web design. It was an article by a gentleman named Ethan Marcotte, very well-regarded front-end developer and writer and blogger and speaker. And so that was May 25th, 2010. The interesting thing to think about is 2010, that was 3 years after the original iPhone came out, which is sort of a lifetime in technology when you think about it. And this article really changed everything with how we do front-end web design. It brought about this idea of one code base to rule them all. And specifically, that article calls out a couple things that you got to do to be considered responsive, and that is fluid grids and relative units, flexible images, can't have the fixed width images, and media queries, which was really the underlying technological piece that played into all of this. And it also brought more prominence to some concepts that had been around but were really starting to take off, unrelated, which were the concepts of mobile first and, of course, progressive enhancement. So what's interesting to me is that even though developers, these really smart people, I think we're pretty smart people, even though we had the smartphones in our hands, it took 3 years to go from this to this. For those of you that can't see, that's width to max width, right? That's really the difference that we're talking about here, right? Like not fixing the width of our site. I'm oversimplifying, obviously, but that's the basic concept. So at least my memes work. That's the important thing, right? So people really started freaking out when this started happening, and particularly companies who had a lot of money invested in their websites started freaking out about what they were going to do about responsive web design. And developers really had to scramble. And developers weren't in any different of a situation than their bosses who wanted this to happen in the beginning. So suddenly everybody wants this responsive site, right? And that's great because responsive obviously solves a lot of problems on mobile devices. It really optimizes the site and gets us into this single code base and site that refactors itself to the user, not the user refactoring itself to the site. But it also introduced a pretty good list of new problems. First of all, as I mentioned, there's a learning curve. This isn't something people just knew how to do out of the box. It's really difficult and impossible to test for all variations of all screen sizes and all devices and all operating systems and every exponential combination of those three factors. How do we design for it? The design paradigm's really shifted here. We're talking about a very small vertical screen as opposed to the large, typically horizontal screens that we've dealt with for years. Arguably, it takes more development time. I would say if you're talking about separate mobile site, maybe not necessarily, but some would say it takes more time to get responsive right than when you used to only have to deal with one resolution. We're not only talking about the website, we're now also talking about the device that's rendering the website. And so performance becomes a lot more important. That's obviously getting better as devices get faster and internet connections get better. But we've historically been dealing with smaller, slower devices that may or may not have a fast internet connection, or may have a fast internet connection until you drive through a part of town that doesn't have LTE, right? So what happened then was we saw this advent of the responsive frameworks. And a couple of big names popped up originally. The first one is Bootstrap, came about in August of 2011. And the second one, anybody know that little guy on the right? What's that? Ionic's on the bottom there, but the guy on top, that's Foundation, Zerb Foundation. Yep. So similar to Bootstrap, kind of takes similar philosophies, a little more, at least historically, it's been a little more lightweight and doesn't have as many bells and whistles as Bootstrap, but it's the same concept. Today, we're mostly going to be talking about Bootstrap because it's in the name of my talk, so I have to. But both of those really came about, and they both popped up about the same time, within about a month of each other back in 2011. And then I also mentioned some frameworks. They're sort of on the fringe there, which are things like jQuery Touch, or jQuery Mobile and Sensor Touch and Ionic, which have sort of taken this approach of, especially if you're dealing with like a separate mobile site, that are really optimizing for touch environments and that sort of thing. So they're similar, and they definitely make things a little faster for development, but semi-related. So Bootstrap, originally called Twitter Blueprint, later called Twitter Bootstrap, and then changed to Bootstrap. It is open source, and it's built on Less, at least for now. And there is a SaaS fork of it available already. And it was built by 2 Twitter employees, obviously with the name. I like to think that they were just going to release this on their own, and then Twitter found out and said, why don't you go ahead and put Twitter on the front of that since you used some company time to work on this. I'm just speculating on that one, I don't know. But 2 guys named Mark Otto and Jacob Thornton, we'll talk about Mark more in a moment, use this as a framework to encourage consistency across internal tools. And I highlight internal because it's sort of the crux of what I want to talk about today. So Mark Otto said, we saw ourselves build something much more substantial than another internal tool. Months later, we ended up with an early version of Bootstrap as a way to document and share common design patterns and assets within the company. So there's some keywords in there, internal, within, that I want to make sure we pick up on. So what does a framework do well? I have some opinions on Bootstrap. I probably wouldn't be giving this talk if I didn't. But a framework does do some things really well. It does lower the barrier for entry into responsive design, which is important. It does allow for really rapid prototyping. And one thing I would say is, regardless of anything else I say about responsive frameworks today, if you're in a situation where you need to churn out a proof of concept or a prototype, and time is not on your side or budget is not on your side, by all means, use it for the prototyping phase if that's applicable to your situation. It does create a consistent design language and coding style across your projects. And that can be really, really useful for companies for developers who work in very large environments, very large companies, or across large teams, or possibly even across multiple offices or even international companies. I actually gave this presentation for an insurance company once, and they had offices spread out throughout the US and Ireland even. So for them, it was very, very beneficial to have this common code base and this common speaking language they could use across teams, regardless of where they were located. It does establish a responsive grid, and anybody who has done responsive work before will probably tell you that can be the trickiest part of doing on your own, of kind of growing your own, or at least it has been in the past. And I kind of mentioned this with the consistent design language, but it creates a consistent set of components. So things like buttons and lists and tabs and forms and media blocks. We're no longer having to roll our own or try to fake any sort of interfaces or build these interactive components that maybe don't play nice across different browsers. Things like tabs and certain button configurations may not actually work right without JavaScript. So the nice thing about the frameworks, especially Bootstrap, is it does give you all the JavaScript that you need to wire it up. You basically copy-paste their code, and you implement the JavaScript in the way they tell you to, and you've got functioning UI components. For anyone who's terrified of JavaScript, that's pretty appealing, right? So from our list originally of problems that responsive design caused, and it's a little small there. There's the learning curve. I feel like it does check that off. Here's where my opinions start coming in. It's impossible to test for all variations of screen sizes, devices, and operating systems. I do feel like a framework does a pretty good job of helping to solve for that, because you're now using a consistent library and a consistent framework that's been hopefully pretty thoroughly tested across browsers and across devices. How do we design for it? I call this a yellow checkbox because it does help. As I said, it does give you these consistent UI elements that you can reuse. But from a design perspective, I also think it causes some issues. So we'll talk about that more in a bit. Arguably takes more development time. I would wholeheartedly agree that it saves time up front, and I'm calling it yellow for problems it can cause later on. And we will talk about that at length. And I'm calling it a big red no checkbox on performance takes a front seat. And again, we'll talk about that in a minute here. So you're thinking to yourself, frameworks, they've got everything, right? These are amazing. Why aren't we using these for absolutely everything? I really wish we had a martini bar like that, or a Bloody Mary bar like that at work, but we don't have quite that many ingredients in ours. But except they don't. There are some things that obviously they don't do real well. And before we get too far into frameworks themselves, I want to talk about something that's important to me, which is this idea of teaching libraries versus languages. I obviously speak a decent amount, and I also used to do some adjunct teaching on the side. And one thing I've noticed is that when you talk about new developers coming into our industry, what are we teaching them? Are we teaching them the native languages and the raw tool sets that they need, or are we teaching them a layer of abstraction and a set of libraries on top of that? I talked to developer after developer after developer, and this crosses not just responsive frameworks, but also things like jQuery on the JavaScript side, where they'll call themselves a JavaScript developer, but really they know a little jQuery. They'll say they can implement a front end, but really they know Bootstrap. And I think even on the CSS side with preprocessors, they may know Sass or less, but they don't know how to implement some of the raw things that Sass and less or PostCSS are doing for them. So this concept of new normal is sort of troubling to me. And it's part of the reason I give this talk is I want to make sure that we're not bringing new developers in who are learning at this abstracted level. I was trying to think of where this concept of new normal can be seen. And I came up with a lot of ideas, and at the end of the day, I, of course, ended up on the world's greatest website, right? And I started looking up posts about things that people had been told by their parents that they believed for well beyond the number of years that they should know. So just to give you a few little anecdotes that I thought were funny. And it's always dads, by the way, because that's what dads do, right? So I thought elemento was a single letter called elemento, sort of like W. So this poor person thought this for way longer than they should have. My dad once told me ponies were horses that lied, so they shrank. Made me not want to go on a pony ride, don't want to hang out with lying horses. I'll read this one, it's getting a little small there. My dad told me to make sure I fully dry off after a shower before walking to my room, otherwise I'd catch a draft. I swear he said catch a giraffe, so for weeks after, I could be caught running naked from the bathroom to my bedroom, dripping wet, never caught that damn giraffe. Again, it's just this concept of are we are we extending out the amount of time that people are knowing these things? Or are we extending out the level of abstraction, or are we making it so that people don't know the raw underlying things that they really should? And dads are trolls. Yep, there's my point there. So again, framework shouldn't necessarily be a default, and that's where I really want to come into this. Before you decide to use a responsive framework in your project, if I haven't completely unsold you from it by the end of this talk, hopefully I can at least have you do it a little differently. So there's two questions I want you to ask yourself. Does the value that the framework provide actually outweigh any potential pitfalls that it might have? And secondly, am I asking my end users, my site visitors, to shoulder the burden of the conveniences that I get during development? And again, if you insist on using a framework, if I can't talk you out of it entirely with this talk, at least try to use it better, and we'll walk through a couple ways you can do that. I'm going to break this down into 4 different sections, which is, I call it attack of the clones, right tool for the job, performance is king, and choose your framework like you'd choose your spouse. All right, attack of the clones. Has anyone seen this movie by any chance? Multiplicity. It's a great movie if you get a chance to see it, older movie. It's all about a guy named Doug who's got typical life problems. He's busy, he's married, he's got a busy job, and he just doesn't have enough time to do what he needs to do. So he of course, in madcap, I think early 90s movie style, he has a mad scientist friend who figures out how to clone people, so he clones himself. And that goes pretty well, except if you ever make a photocopy of a photocopy, it starts getting a little blurry around the edges. And by the 3rd clone, the guy's wearing hats on his head and smearing pizza on his face. And, so I bring this up because you run into the same concept with these frameworks. So we talked about creates a consistent design language and coding style. And I said that was sort of a benefit. But if you look here, this is just a sampling of button styles that come straight out of Bootstrap. And they're consistent. They give you some nice variations. You do get large, small, extra small, that sort of thing. I'm oversimplifying. Bootstrap gives a lot more than this. But the problem you start to run into when you talk about consistent design style is not only is it consistent for your project, it's consistent for every website across the internet who's using the default Bootstrap site or styles. So just a few examples here. This is it's an older snapshot, but this is the Bootstrap homepage at one point, and you'll see they make use of sort of that large hero at the top. Their button treatments are there. Font styling is pretty consistent. These are sort of telltale Bootstrap things. I see a few people nodding their heads like they're starting to recognize some Bootstrap things a little bit. And by the way, if anybody made any of these sites that I'm picking on here, I apologize in advance. This is a site called Critique, I believe is how it's pronounced. And a lot of these I found on a Made with Bootstrap website, so they're sort of advertising that this is Bootstrap. You'll notice some similarities. Again, I think they actually took the exact same hex value for their hero. Their nav is this sort of typical pill style. Their button styling is very similar. Their font treatments are the same. Again, buttons might be altered just slightly, but they're fairly similar. So it's a similar feeling site. There's a site called Dropbucket, much different looking. But when you really start digging into it, consistent button styles, consistent horizontal pill styles on that, navigation elements, pagination, it's not really pagination, but several components that have that sort of Bootstrap component feel to it. This is a sort of a help finding website. Again, large hero, horizontal navigation, similar font treatments, similar button styles. We could get deeper into component level stuff too, but that's the idea. Again, big hero, consistent button styles. And just to prove I'm not a complete hypocrite, this is an old version of my portfolio site. We're all familiar with the cobbler's children has no shoes idea. I threw this together in like an hour. It's hideous. But again, I just use Bootstrap. So I am a complete hypocrite basically by ripping on Bootstrap. But again, consistent button styles, consistent fonts, consistent navigation. It's all very out of the box feeling. So again, it creates this consistent design language and coding style, but is it maybe a little bit too consistent, especially when we start talking about the web as a whole? So on that point, can we do a little bit differently? The big thing is to try to customize those default components as much as you can so that you don't look like every other Bootstrap site that has ever been made. It's great that you got your site up fast, but you also want to stand out from the crowd. All right, right tool for the job, point number 2. Little audience participation here. I'm not going to tell you what you need them for, but you can choose one of these two things, either the Victorinox Swiss Army knife or the $4 scalpel. Which one do you choose? Who chooses Swiss Army knife? Who chooses scalpel? A bunch of people just don't want to play. Okay. Fine. It is a trick. You're right. You're on to me. All right, we're going camping. Those of you who have the Swiss Army knife, you're probably a little better off. You can cut down a tree and kill the bear and use the toothpick to pick the meat out of your teeth when you're done eating it, all that good stuff. Scalpel people, you might do okay, but that's not the greatest situation. Now you're going into surgery, and the anesthesiologist has the mask on your face, and you're counting back from 10, and just before you go under, you see him pull out the big saw blade on his Victorinox Swiss Army knife. So the point there is just that there's an appropriate tool for the job. Certain tools are better for certain situations than others, and a tool that can do everything fairly well isn't necessarily always better than a specialized tool that can do one thing really, really well. Here's an example from Bootstrap. As we mentioned, Bootstrap gives you a lot of components out of the box that you can just drop into your website. And this is just a sampling from actually an older version of Bootstrap, because I'm lazy and don't update my slides every time Bootstrap puts out a new version. But here's some of the things that you can do with Bootstrap out of the box. And if you just install Bootstrap as a whole, the way it comes prepackaged from their website, this is what you get. But what if what you need are these things? So you're now loading in and, again, presenting to your front-end users all of these tools, or maybe not even presenting to your users, shouldering the download and parsing responsibility to your users for things that may not even come into your site. So think about that for a second. You're loading in the Swiss Army knife when you might actually need the scalpel. So what can we do a little bit differently in the right tool for the job sector? So first of all, framework shouldn't necessarily be a dependency for every project to evaluate whether it's actually needed before you start. If you're building a fairly nimble small site and it only has 1 or 2 or 3 components, would it be faster just to code those yourself? Or if you're not as strong with front-end development techniques, find a smaller, more single-purpose plugin that can handle what you need to do versus loading in this massive framework that can do everything. If you do decide you find a framework to be appropriate, establish a baseline of components you want to use. So if you're on a large-scale project, if you're fortunate enough to be in the early planning phases of a project, and if you can't talk the powers that be out of a framework for whatever reason, and there might be valid reasons, it's an important thing to do to actually sit down and plan out the components that you know will be on the site for sure from the beginning. As I mentioned, Bootstrap is built on Less and Sass. So if possible, try to strip out from your code base before it ever gets to your end users, or conditionally load in the CSS and JavaScript for the unused components. So what I mean by that is maybe you have 5 components on your site that are needed across your site. So okay, go ahead and load the CSS and JavaScript globally for those 5 things, because you're probably going to get a lot of reuse out of that. However, if you have a component that then pops up later that maybe is only on one very small obscure page, consider only loading the CSS or JavaScript pieces for that component on those individual pages. And then if you start seeing a lot of reuse for that component, then go ahead and add it back into your main code base so that you're loading it more universally. Okay, let's talk performance a little bit. Because the big issue on this is, in my opinion, it's all great that we as developers, if I convince you today, are going to go back and say, we should get rid of our framework because it's cool from a development standpoint. But you have to sell that. There has to be return on investment. And you may come back and say, we need to hand code and hand craft all this beautiful HTML and CSS and JavaScript from scratch. And your business owners will say, that's great, but we don't have the budget for that. We need to get this out last week. So you may not have the option. So how about a few talking points on performance? As I mentioned, on these small devices, performance really does become a lot more important. So to give you a few stats here, Walmart said they see a sharp decline in conversion rates as average site load time increases from 1 to 4 seconds. A little vague, but I got more. Every 1 second shaved off of load time increased conversions by 2%, and incremental revenue went up 1% with every 100 millisecond decrease in load time. That's pretty substantial. How about Amazon? 1% decrease in revenue for every 100 milliseconds added to page load. So they kind of went the other direction, but same stat. 1%, it seems like 100 milliseconds appears to be the magic number in terms of 100 milliseconds slower, 1% down, 100 milliseconds faster. You get the idea. Stat from Etsy, which Etsy actually does a wonderful job with a lot of things on the web. They found that 160K increase in page size equaled a 12% higher bounce rate on mobile devices. And this one's a little bit generic, but Google says shoppers expect pages to load in seconds or less. At 3 seconds, a large share abandoned. They don't specifically identify what large share means. And Microsoft has, I think, kind of the summary for this whole thing, which is 250 milliseconds, either slower or faster, is the magic number for competitive advantage on the web. So they're speaking bigger picture there. So performance matters. And it particularly matters if we're talking e-commerce, but I think this can be applied to any website you're building. You want your site to be fast and nimble and ready to go for your customers as soon as possible. Bootstrap, again, I'm lazy and have old slides, but Bootstrap 3.2, the Minified CSS and JavaScript only, is 142 kilobytes. That's Minified, not run through gzip or anything like that, but Minified is 142K. That doesn't include any sort of theming that goes on top of Bootstrap, which they did in that version actually offer a separate theme pack. I can't remember if they still do that or not. That came in at 19K, and then they have the entire Font Awesome library, which you can load in, which comes in at 147K. So remember, 250 milliseconds is your competitive advantage. 100 milliseconds in either direction starts to cause problems, and we're talking 142 just for your baseline CSS and JavaScript with Bootstrap. So what can we do a little bit differently? Obvious things: minify, uglify, concatenate. These are just standards of front-end development at this point. If you're not using some sort of build tool at this point, I would recommend it. And just a quick survey on that. Who's using Sass or Lest or PostCSS, some sort of processor on their code? Good. That number of hands has gone up over the last couple of years I've been doing this, and that makes me really happy. So make sure you're doing just those baseline front-end developer tasks, because that's important. So I mentioned this in the previous section, but make sure you're stripping out tools that you're not using. So don't bring the Swiss Army knife to your website. But I see this done a lot of different ways, and sometimes I see it done in really bad ways with Bootstrap. One way I see this done is that people load the massive full implementation of Bootstrap into their site, and then they write another CSS file or another JavaScript file that overrides during runtime the styles that are declared in your baseline Bootstrap. So now we have a lot of fun things going on. Not only are we loading that 142K or more baseline file, we're now adding in a second or third or fourth or fifth HTTP request and creating slowdown and performance issues there. And we're also adding, of course, just heft and bulk to our page load times. So don't do that, if at all possible. Again, when you start your project, if you're able to identify which components you're going to use, the best thing you can do is actually to not download the production-ready minified Bootstrap, but actually run it through your preprocessor and actually take out the code that you're not going to need and recompile it. So take out anything, and I will give Bootstrap credit. They've gotten much better at making it very modular and very possible to strip that code out without adversely affecting things all over your site. It's very well documented. So that way, when you recompile, your file size is no longer 142K, and you're only loading the things that you need. So don't load that code unless you need to. And if you need the other stuff, conditionally load it in piece by piece. So let's go to choose your framework like you'd choose your spouse. Because, hey, who needs furniture anyway, right? I want to take a look at Bootstrap's markup a little bit. And this is Bootstrap 3. This is actually a screenshot straight out of their documentation. And for anybody who's used Bootstrap before, you're probably intimately familiar with their class names, especially on the grid. Does anybody just cringe when they see these? I do personally. The structure is typically to wrap a row div around a row of elements, and this is how you're going to establish your grid and your columns in your website. Inside that, we're going to have our columns. So their nomenclature is to do col, dash, and then the size where it's accurate, and then a number. And that number is going to represent how many out of a total number of columns this column represents. So it's the total of these two adding up to equal the full width of the row. And they also added some complexity in Bootstrap 3, which actually lets you, as you can see with the XS and the medium, I guess that's all I've got up here, allow you to change that out for different breakpoint sizes. So they've added quite a bit of flexibility and I would say complexity also. But that is their class names. So this is, if you're using Bootstrap out of the box, how you're going to write your markup to handle laying out your site. My question to you guys is, besides that just being kind of hideous, what happens to this markup the first time you need to redesign? Are you going to know, for one thing, they're not very semantic, so are you going to know how to change this out? And is your structure going to match what Bootstrap is allowing for, and how much rewrite are you going to have to do in your markup? So now we're not talking about CSS changes. We're talking about page by page by page of markup. I understand CMSs and templates obviously make that a lot simpler, but this is still a new conversation once we're talking about markup changes and not just CSS changes. So my bigger question, I do see that first issue as important, but what happens when the framework itself decides to redesign or to refactor? And you're probably thinking, well, that would never happen. Why would a framework just abandon its entire user base and rewrite itself, right? Here's Bootstrap 1 and 2. You'll see row, and you will see a different nomenclature for how you actually declare the individual columns. So there is no, just to go back to that, there is no call XS12, call XS6. There is span 4 and span 8. So if you were using Bootstrap 1 or 2, and suddenly Bootstrap, well, let me keep going here. Bootstrap 3 came out, introducing its new structure, and your boss said, wow, there's some really great features here that we need to implement that are built into Bootstrap 3. That's not an easy process, going from one to the other, right? So that really, I think, upset a lot of people and burned a lot of people when Bootstrap did change their naming conventions. You're probably thinking, well, they're not going to do that again, right? This is Mark Otto, one of the creators of Bootstrap. You might remember I mentioned him as one of the 2 guys who invented it. He said, oh, by the way, Bootstrap 4 will be in Sass. And if you care, version 5 will be in post-CSS because, holy crap, that sounds cool. So we may not be done yet with this stuff changing out. So I love this concept. There's a great article by a gentleman named Matthew Copeland who coined this term. I'd love to say I came up with this, but he definitely did, called Bootstrap Bankruptcy. And he says, it's the point at which the value gained from the custom interface is less than the effort required to refactor Bootstrap and implement the new interface. In other words, are you getting more value out of using Bootstrap than you will be losing at the point that you need to refactor or redesign or upgrade Bootstrap or make any sort of substantial change? So how can we do this a little bit differently? And if there's one slide in here, I hope you can take some value. I know this isn't a very code-heavy presentation, but if there's a slide I hope you can take some value from, it's coming up here in just a second. For one thing, architect your application today like the framework's going to change tomorrow. And as we saw, if you're using Bootstrap, it probably will. And consider, here's my kind of crux of this whole thing, consider extending Bootstrap classes with Sass or less rather than using its provided classes. So what I mean by that is keep your class names very semantic and human readable, and that way you're not locked into your framework. And that looks a little bit something like this. If you're using Sass, write your markup like the top, which is, you can still use row if you want. That's a relatively semantic class. But instead of using XS, small, whatever it might be, instead of using those sort of ugly built-in Bootstrap classes, give them semantic names, give them semantic elements, give them everything that you need to do to build your application so that it is semantically correct in terms of class names. And then if you can see my CSS down here, I'm actually using a Sass example here, which is the concept of extend. And extend will basically extend out a baseline style and class name and apply it to another class name. So this right here gives us semantic markup. And then when we style these things out, we can actually use the built-in preprocessor extend functionality to extend these semantic names. So now, when Bootstrap upgrades, it's still going to be painful, don't get me wrong. But we don't have a markup problem anymore. Well, you probably still have a markup problem when you redesign, but it's at least a little cleaner and easier to understand, right? Things are a bit more semantic and manageable. So it's a level of separation and abstraction that I think will get you away from being locked into Bootstrap. And so I guess the summary of that is be framework agnostic. All I know is that I know nothing, right? We don't know what's going to happen with Bootstrap. We do know semantic markup is a real thing, and we can always count on that. So try to stick to that as much as possible. So to kind of summarize for you guys, responsive design has obviously come a long way in the last, not even 5 years, 7 years. And frameworks are a natural reaction to this huge shift that we're seeing. These CSS frameworks, they really do have their advantages, especially if you're prototyping, or as I mentioned, if you're working in a very large organization or multinational organization, situation like that. That said, I also see them as fairly problematic, especially when we're talking production sites and not just prototypes. So again, avoid frameworks if you can would be my primary advice, but I realize there are situations where you must use them. And if that happens, just try to work around their shortcomings as much as possible. How you can do that, or to go on a little bit more, frameworks can make your site look generic out of the box, so customize the look and feel. Every site has different needs. Don't assume a framework is an automatic dependency. Performance matters, and frameworks can and will change, and you need to keep your site as agnostic of those changes as humanly possible. So I asked 2 questions at the beginning, which was, does the value of a framework, or does the value that the framework provides actually outweigh any potential pitfalls? And my hope is after seeing some of the ways that it can come back to bite you, you can take those things into consideration and make an intelligent decision for yourself on that. And again, am I asking my end users to shoulder the burden of the conveniences of the framework that I get during the development process? Is there anything that my end user is actually benefiting from on this? Or is this entirely related to the development process? And again, that's not a black and white answer for every project and every company, but just take those things into account when you get started. And that's all I've got. Thank you guys very much. It looks like I've got about, I think they're supposed to be at 45 minutes, so I got a couple minutes here, like 3 or 4 minutes, if anybody has any questions. Yes?
Regarding performance thing, there was several slides back that had that checklist.
Yep.
Red, and I'm trying to understand what you mean with red. Do you believe that things improved in that area, or have we progressed?
It's interesting you say that. I actually think, and there's a lot of research to show this, and you just gave me an idea for what to add to this presentation next time, is there's a lot of research on page weight. And page weight is actually getting much worse. Developers are not getting better at making light, nimble sites. And I think a large part of that has to do with, and I love Node, don't get me wrong, but the Node movement, the dependency movement, the idea of being able to drop in a library or a framework to take care of everything that we need. And that works really well server-side, but I think when you start talking about front end, we need to be very, very acutely aware of what we're serving to our users. You know, we've got to fit a lot of code, and we got to fit a lot of junk through the pipe, right? We got to get a lot of stuff to them, and we have to do it over and over and over again every time they visit that page across potentially millions of people. So yeah, I think the research shows that sites are actually getting heavier and bulkier, and to some extent slower. So frameworks CSS frameworks play into that. The less we can do to contribute to that bloat and help the industry out, I think is better.
It would be an interesting statistic to see how many people give up on LinkedIn, Facebook. You know, click it, and it switches and tries to load it after about 5 seconds.
Yeah. And an interesting thing about that is if you've noticed any of Facebook's instant articles, which is actually an entire initiative they're pushing, and actually marketing to news organizations and things like that, is the idea of actually feed your content into Facebook with this instant articles API that they provide, and we'll serve it up for you. And there's a lot of ad revenue stuff going on there too. That's not a completely innocent move that Facebook is making in doing those instant articles, but it's also pretty brilliant from their standpoint, because there's so much more value to Facebook in someone clicking an article and having it just immediately appear because its performance has been optimized and it's pre-cached and preloaded and all the things that it needs to be done, versus offsetting that and distributing that out to news organizations and websites across the world. So I think you're even seeing that with things like instant articles, where it's performance has become so important to them that they're bringing it back in-house, basically.
I think for performance, you mentioned only using the pieces that you need, but even in Bootstrap, even with something on the component level, like buttons,
Mm-hmm.
it loads 700 button styles.
Yep.
Have you ever seen a neon green info button on the site?
Right. And it brings up that depending on your shop, if you have an in-house design firm or if you're working with contractors or anything like that, make sure you're working with them too, because that's a great point. If they have a color palette of 3 to 4 colors and a defined 1 or 2 sets of button styles, like why the hell would you load 14 sets of buttons across your site that are just default to Bootstrap? Or even worse, load them and then load a second style sheet of your own that tries to fake those styles in. So yeah, good point. Other questions? Looks like we're right about at time, but maybe time for 1 or 2 more questions? Yeah, go ahead.
So I like the idea of stripping the framework to only use what you need. But if you want to do like a minor version upgrade after that, doesn't it greatly impact that? Because now you have to strip it again.
That's a good point. Yeah, you do run into that, and you would have to kind of come back in and redo things. I'm not familiar enough with the less SAS structure of Bootstrap to say for sure if they make that an upgradable path. I would guess it's a challenge. So yeah, that is something to keep in mind. I talked about all the ways we can improve upgradability, and then you're right. By stripping stuff out, you do limit a little bit. If anybody has experience on that, I'd love to hear it actually. But yeah.
Yeah, I was wondering how choosing a CSS methodology played into making your site more scalable like that. Like, are there any in your experience that you've used it along with a framework, or do you either get around using a framework? That you prefer for semantic meaning?
Oh, sure. Well, I tend to be pretty framework free. Like I tend not to use them, and I usually follow a BEM methodology, which is a very component-based methodology of writing your CSS. So I'd say if you can stick to calling something best practice in front end is always I kind of hate doing that, but I'd say BEM is sort of an established standard. Yeah, a good practice a best practice this week, you know. But I would say if you can stick to some sort of naming convention, such as BEM, which will do that sort of thing. BEM also helps enforce component-based CSS, so you don't have styles impacting all kinds of crap going on all over your site. So that's another way. Using a good methodology like that can help a lot. And another thing is if you do go with a framework, but maybe you don't need all the things Bootstrap does, look around for a lighter weight framework that maybe just gives you the grid or just gives you a couple of components or that sort of thing, and see if you can find sort of a tailored version. So,
that helps a lot with the upgradability thing. If you own your class names,
right.
You wrote your class names, then the layer, whether it's Bootstrap or Suzy grids, whatever you're putting underneath them, you still have ownership of those class names.
Yeah. Exactly, and that's why I always show that extends trick, because it's like if you can do that, you've abstracted away from it enough anyway, so, or hopefully enough. I think we're out of time. If anybody else has any other questions, feel free to come up. I'll be here for a little bit, and thank you guys for coming. Appreciate it.